Odo is that slime guy who can shapeshift, but who is Odo? Hey Trekkies, Christian Fox here with another video for you. Today, I want to talk about one of the most morally complex characters in Star Trek and my personal favorite regular character in DS9 and answer the question, who is Odo? Odo Itel, a First Founders homeworld native, where Changelings are from, is one of the main protagonists in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Odo was portrayed by the late great Renee A., whose name I still can't pronounce after all these years and butcher it every time. Some of Odo's dialogue from DS9 was used in an episode of Star Trek Prodigy, allowing for one last final appearance in Trek. In his role of Chief of Security, Odo was responsible for maintaining order and the security of the station. I would argue that Odo is the best security officer in Trek because of how many crimes he stopped and or solved, as well as how little bad guys actually take over the station, which I know isn't entirely fair given the nature of the show. Odo is an incredibly skilled investigator and very much reminds me of a lead detective in a police procedural, especially when he has that great Odo pose as he's interrogating suspects or questioning a witness. As embarrassing it is, I find myself doing that from time to time. Odo has a very strong sense of right and wrong and believes heavily in justice. This is not a bad thing because it generally means people pay for their crime. Yet, it does lead to a potential, shall I say, challenging aspect of the behavior in that his tendency for that behavior and procedures that he uses may be related to police brutality. And I'm using a lot of these maybes and potentiallys because it's obviously a very sensitive subject. In the last 3 years especially, the world has come face to face with the very real nature of police brutality. This isn't new, but it reignited the conversation and some real change was made, though of course, we still have a very long way to go. One area that this impacted was police procedurals. No longer was the tough guy cop that goes rogue or abuses their authority rewarded. On a side note, I really appreciated how NCIS and NCIS New Orleans dealt with that. But I digress. Let's bring it back to Odo. While I don't think Odo was always abusing his authority, there were some things that in rewatches I feel were crossing the line. One example of this is his constantly harassing of Quark. Admittedly, those scenes are hilarious and really help develop the bond between Quark and Odo, but a lot of the times he was abusing his authority. So much so, Odo remarks to Sisko that he always investigates Quark when a crime is committed, even if no evidence suggests he was involved. Again, a hilarious line, but hugely problematic. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about some of that sweet shapeshifting action. Obviously, the big thing about Odo is that he's a changeling and can thus shapeshift into almost anything. He can morph into animals, objects, and even surfaces. Even more wild is his communicator, which he shapeshifts part of his body into, just like his uniform. This is always cool, and I never get tired of watching him shapeshift. The visual effect is spot on for the time, and the effect used in later seasons does a decent job holding up to today's standards. As awesome as abilities are, he does have some limitations. He's vulnerable to energy weapons and has to revert to his gelatinous state every 17 hours. If he doesn't, things don't go super well for him. In one situation, he was trapped in a turbo lift and didn't feel comfortable regenerating in front of Loxana Troi. During that time, his face looked as if it was melting. In another situation, Garrick tortures Odo by using a device that prevents him from changing his shape. During that time, his skin looked as if it was peeling off. In normal conditions, Odo simply reverts back to his gelatinous state and stays in his pail. Beyond just being a cool thing that Odo can do, DS9 was able to make it much more than just a cool gimmick and have it be a fundamental part of the character. Odo, because of his changeling nature, considers himself to be separate from humanoids and in many ways above them. There are many times when he will comment on humanoids and say things like, "I've noticed that you humanoids focus way too much on rank." This is mostly harmless and is meant as good social commentary. Later, it does briefly become a problem, but for the most part, it works as a really good exploration of the character, of him trying to find himself, as well as allow him to fill the other role, kind of like Spock and Data. In the early seasons, Odo doesn't know where he came from and searches for others like him. Although he doesn't have parents in the traditional sense, he did have a father-like figure in Dr. Mora, a Bajoran scientist who discovered that he was sentient and helped him unlock his shapeshifting abilities. The two had a very strained relationship because of the experiments, but later are able to reconcile. Eventually, he finds his people, called the Founders, and gets exposed to the Great Link. The Great Link is basically all changelings living together in their gelatinous state, sharing thoughts and perceptions. Odo also learns that he is one of 100 infants that were sent out into the universe, the goal being to eventually return home with knowledge of what was out there. Unfortunately for Odo, it turns out the Founders are warlords bent on conquering other civilizations and eventually the entire Alpha Quadrant. Even worse, Odo is forced to kill a fellow changeling to save the Defiant. Because no changeling has harmed another, Odo is punished by being permanently turned into a solid, aka human. Although Odo initially finds this extremely difficult, he slowly embraces his new life. He starts to enjoy eating and drinking, he shares meals with friends, and even actually pursued a romantic relationship. Eventually, Odo's changeling nature and abilities are restored. Like so many things already discussed, I could probably do a whole video on Solid Odo. Adding to Odo's troubles is that he gets infected with a virus that he inadvertently passes on to the rest of the Founders when he is sent back for judgment. The disease prevents them from changing shape and slowly kills them. Early on in DS9, like Kira, Odo is not a believer in the Federation. He believed they talk a good game, but didn't trust them. As the series progresses, we see that Odo trusts and respects them more, but is still ultimately wary of them. Personally, I think it's a really strong choice for Odo to not fully embrace the Federation the same way the Starfleet crew does. When it comes to his friendships, he ends up respecting the crew, but doesn't really have close friendships with people aside from Quark and Kira. The relationship between Odo and Quark is one of the many gems of the series. They are technically adversaries, as Odo is the cop and Quark is the con man, but it's through their ongoing animosity that the two start to really care about each other, and eventually kind of become best friends. One of the sweetest things about them is that Quark is the only person that knows about Odo's feelings for Kira. When Odo is freaking out and smashing everything in his quarters when he realizes that she has feelings for Shakar, Quark is there to comfort him. But because they're Odo and Quark, Quark says it because he's losing a betting pool that Odo will solve the crime, which allows Odo to regain his focus. The next time we see Odo completely torn up about Kira, Quark once again puts him in his place, letting him know that he had multiple opportunities to make a move, but didn't, and that he's cold, rigid, and remote. We see even more instances of this play out, such as when Quark tells Odo that smuggling will go up while he's gone to the homeworld because he can't maintain his shape, or when Odo tells Quark that he's the most devious Ferengi he knows when Quark is feeling down. Odo has a pretty good relationship with Garak, with the two of them becoming breakfast buds after Garak tortures him for information. This is not so much because of Garak's actions, but instead because they both understand the longing each of them feel to be with their people. When Odo can't maintain his shape and is forced to go back to the homeworld, Garak is tasked with keeping Odo distracted by telling him lies and half-truths about his spy days. Of course, his closest relationship is with Kira. Odo and Kira's romantic relationship is one of the less popular things about DS9. Personally, I enjoy and love that we get to see their relationship develop and mature. They start off as friends, have a couple of major falling outs, and then take the next step. They're cute together, and I love the conversation where Kira calls out Odo for always bringing up the worst case scenario, and Odo responding that he's expected to be suspicious and dour, and that he can't let others see how happy he really is. Where Odo gets morally complex is when they deal with his role during the Bajoran occupation and his actions during the Dominion occupation. Prior to being chief of security on DS9 with the Federation in control, he worked in a similar capacity for Gul Dukat during the occupation. From the start, we are told by Kira and other Bajorans that Odo was awesome and trustworthy despite working for the Cardassians because of his sense of justice and because he would always do the right thing. This is mostly true, but later in the series, it's revealed that he sent 3 innocent people to their deaths after believing they attempted to kill Gul Dukat based on circumstantial evidence. Obviously, this deeply disturbs Kira, but they're able to work things out. Later in this series, during one of my personal favorite storylines, where DS9 gets taken over by the Dominion, Odo goes through a period of not caring. Initially, he works with Kira and the rest of the Resistance, but as soon as the female Changeling, the leader of the Dominion, comes aboard the station, Odo has a change of heart. After repeatedly linking with the female Changeling, Odo starts believing her and her views that Changelings are superior to solids, a derogatory term toward species that can't shapeshift. In this state, Odo doesn't turn off security alarms, which gets Rom imprisoned while trying to prevent the minefield from being destroyed, effectively guaranteeing the Dominion's victory. Eventually, Odo stamps out of it and saves Kira and the Resistance. Although it's never said on screen, It's been suggested by fans that Odo snapped out of it because of his feelings towards Kira. Once again, Odo and Kira have to work through the experience. Well, friends, that's Odo in a nutshell. One of the many amazing characters in Star Trek DS9. Odo appears in Star Trek DS9 and Star Trek Prodigy.